Frank, your entire supply chain operation is basically a dinosaur fossil. It is embarrassing how manual everything is. Derek Solis said that with a straight face during a Tuesday morning stand-up. And that sentence was the one that started the collapse of my career at Carver Industrial. The man was 32 years old. He had never managed a warehouse floor in his life. And yet he was standing inside a facility that moved $40 million of specialty chemicals to government clients every quarter, calling it a fossil. That was 8 weeks ago. This week, his company is calling me twice a day, begging me to fix what he broke. My name is Frank Malone. I am 54 years old, and until 2 months ago, I was Senior Director of Operations at Carver Industrial Solutions, a specialty chemical manufacturer and distributor based out of Columbus, Ohio. I joined Carver in 2008, back when the business was still small enough that the owner, a retired Army logistics officer named Gene Carver, knew every forklift driver by their kids' names. I was his third full-time hire. When Derek fired me that Tuesday, I had a mortgage with 11 years left on it, a son finishing his final semester at Ohio State, and a mother in an assisted living facility in Westerville that cost $4,200 a month. I did the math on how long my savings would last. It was not a comforting calculation, but Derek did not know something when he stood in front of that whiteboard delivering his little speech about operational agility and digital transformation. I owned the regulatory foundation his entire company was standing on. Not operationally, legally. And the distance between those two words was about to cost him everything. Back in 2008, when I first joined Carver, an old friend of mine named Paul Greco was finishing a contract law certificate through a paralegal program. He was doing it mostly for fun, but he knew enough to be dangerous in exactly the right way. I told him about the job offer from Gene Carver. Small company, huge regulatory burden. A startup trying to break into EPA-regulated chemical distribution. Paul told me, "Frank, you are going to build everything from the ground up. Make sure you own something when it is done." He helped me draft a very specific clause into my employment agreement. Section 9.2 read, "In the event of termination without 60 days written notice, all proprietary process documentation, vendor relationship agreements bearing employee's signature, and state and federal regulatory filings developed or maintained by employee shall revert to employee's designated entity upon termination, effective immediately." Gene Carver signed it in his kitchen over a cup of black coffee. At the time, he was more worried about getting his EPA storage certifications approved and figuring out whether the forklift lease had been structured correctly. He trusted me completely. That trust is why he let me protect myself. And that clause sat there for 16 years. Quiet, buried, untouched, waiting for somebody reckless enough to wake it up. Derek Solis arrived at Carver 11 weeks before he fired me. He had an MBA from Georgetown, a background in e-commerce logistics, and the kind of energy that makes experienced people nervous, not because it is impressive, because it is expensive. He had been sent in by a private equity group out of Atlanta called Meridian Capital Partners. They had acquired a 60% stake in Carver the previous spring. Gene had retired, sold most of his shares, and moved to Sarasota. His son, Kevin, had taken over as CEO, but Kevin did not have the appetite or the experience for a real fight. So when Meridian sent Derek in as Chief Operating Officer to modernize operations ahead of a planned acquisition, Kevin rolled over like a golden retriever. On Derek's first day, he walked through the warehouse in a North Face vest and raw denim jeans, holding a tablet like it was a clipboard, nodding at everything in a way that communicated absolutely nothing. He introduced himself to the floor staff with that polished, workshop-trained casualness that says somebody once taught him how to perform relatability. He told everyone he was there to help Carver punch above its weight class. He called himself an operational architect. In his email signature, below his name and title, he had 3 separate words: builder, disruptor, results-driven. 3 separate words, 3 separate periods. The man was 32 years old and used bullet points in internal emails like they were billable deliverables. His first strategic initiative was what he called a process efficiency audit, which was consultant language for "let me inspect everything Frank built so I can decide what to replace him with." What Derek was looking at was not some harmless back-office stockroom. It was a distribution operation with active compliance agreements across 4 states, 22 vendor contracts I had personally negotiated over 16 years. EPA hazardous material storage permits that had taken 18 months and a law firm to secure, and a DOT transportation certification framework I had rebuilt from scratch after a compliance failure nearly sank the company in 2013. This was not a system you optimized with a SaaS dashboard and a motivational all-hands meeting. One documentation error could trigger a federal inspection. One permit lapse could shut us down for 6 months and cost us 3 of our largest government contracts. But Derek did not see any of that. He saw redundancy. He saw paper-based processes. He saw a 54-year-old operations director who took too long to answer async Slack messages and did not have a LinkedIn profile with a banner image. He started small. He rebranded our internal operations manual as the Carver Playbook and had a designer put gradient colors on the cover. He cut our vendor review cycles in half because, in his words, they were slowing down procurement velocity. He brought in a cloud logistics platform that cost $9,000 a month and had never been stress tested in a regulated chemical environment. Then he started scheduling one-on-ones with my team leads. He called them alignment sessions. What he was actually doing was building a case. After those meetings, my supervisors would come to me looking uneasy. They would say things like, "Derek wants to know why we are still doing manual lot verification," or he asked whether the permit renewal process could be automated. These were people I had trained myself. They knew that in our business, manual verification existed for a reason. Automated systems had failed federal audits 3 times in our industry over the past decade. But Derek had them starting to wonder whether our caution was expertise or just fear dressed up as process. Then my meeting invites started drying up. Vendor calls I had been on for years suddenly no longer needed me. The monthly regulatory review I had run since 2009 was quietly handed to a 26-year-old project coordinator named Josh, a kid with no hazardous materials handling background and no real sense of what he did not know. Derek created a transformation committee on Teams and did not include me. He uploaded screenshots of our process documentation with yellow highlights and comments like unnecessary friction and this adds 0 value. I watched all of it, and I said nothing. I documented everything. Every email, every Teams message, every change to the vendor agreements, every modification to the regulatory filing calendar. I saved it all with timestamps, version histories, and digital signatures. I was not being paranoid. I was being an engineer who had been around long enough to know exactly what comes next when somebody starts circling your work with a highlighter. The moment I knew for certain came during a quarterly review with Meridian Capital. Derek was presenting a new procurement model to the investment partners on a video call. What he was showing them was my vendor framework, repackaged with new terminology and a color-coded dashboard. He presented my supplier relationship structure, the one I had built through 16 years of handshakes, renegotiated terms, and emergency middle-of-the-night calls during chemical shortages, as his optimized supply chain architecture. Then one of the Meridian partners asked a pointed question about our regulatory exposure under the new model. Derek said he would follow up with the compliance team on implementation specifics. The compliance team was me. I was not on the call. That was when I stopped thinking emotionally and started preparing strategically. I pulled everything. Full documentation of the 22 vendor agreements bearing my signature. The EPA storage permit applications listing me as the responsible party and primary contact. The DOT certification framework I had written in 2014 with my name on every filing. The state-level hazardous waste transport agreements in 3 states where I was the named compliance officer of record. I had not gone out of my way to put my name on most of those documents. That is simply what happens when you are the person doing the actual work for 16 years. Your name ends up on things because you are the one carrying them. Most important of all, I found my original employment agreement from 2008, the one Paul had helped me draft. I scanned Section 9.2 and sent it to a labor and contract attorney named Sandra Ye, who had helped me on an unrelated employment matter years earlier. My subject line read, Section 9.2, still enforceable if I am terminated without notice. Her reply came back in under 2 hours. Absolutely enforceable. This would be a significant problem for them. Call me. The firing happened on a Tuesday morning. It always happens at a time people think feels neutral. Derek scheduled what he called a brief operational sync on my calendar for 9 a.m. No agenda. No other attendees. That was the tell. He was on camera, sitting in one of Carver's glass-walled conference rooms, one of the rooms I had watched get built in 2017. He had the expression of a man who had rehearsed the moment and was quietly pleased with how prepared he felt. He started talking about organizational design and where the business needed to go. He used the phrase right-sizing the leadership structure twice. Then he told me my role was being eliminated effective immediately. He paused there, like he believed the silence added weight. Then he said the sentence that sealed everything. "Honestly, Frank, your fingerprints are on so much of the old infrastructure. We are grateful for that. But all of that belongs to Carver now, so we will take it from here." He smiled when he said it. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just confidently. Like he genuinely had no idea what those words meant. There was no HR representative on the call. No severance paperwork. No transition discussion. Just a Teams meeting, and 30 minutes later, a calendar full of standing meetings disappearing from my screen. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten him. I closed my laptop, walked into my kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. I had been sober for 11 years, and water was what that moment called for. Then I opened the laptop again and wrote the email that changed everything. To Sandra Ye, attorney at law. Subject: terminated this morning. Section 9.2 is active. I attached my employment agreement, my vendor contract inventory, the EPA permit documentation, the state compliance filings, and a directory of every regulatory relationship in which I was the named individual. Then I wrote, "They terminated me this morning without notice. No paperwork, no severance, nothing. Just a video call and a comment about how my work belongs to them now. Section 9.2 is in effect as of 9 a.m. today. Please initiate the reversion process and draft the necessary notices. Also, prepare an invoice. Let's make sure they understand what they actually just let go." I hit send. And for the first time in 2 months, I slept well. Message 5. Tiptop. Message 6. What Sandra and I did over the next 4 days was not emotional. It was surgical. And every move mattered. The vendor agreements were the first lever. Of the 22 supplier contracts I had personally negotiated, 19 were structured with me as the named authorized representative. In a company that had grown the way Carver had, that was not unusual. When you spend 16 years building relationships from nothing, contracts tend to get signed by the person who is actually in the room. Derek's team had spent 3 weeks auditing those vendor relationships. What they had not done was read the signature pages carefully. Sandra drafted formal notices to all 19 vendors, informing them of the leadership change and requesting confirmation on whether they intended to continue under new authorization. 14 of them responded within 48 hours asking for clarification because their agreements contained language requiring 30 days notice before a change in the named representative. 3 of them said they would need to review the relationship entirely before extending under new management. That alone would have been enough to create a mess. But the EPA permit situation was worse. I was listed as the responsible party on our primary hazardous material storage permits in Ohio and Indiana. Those permits do not transfer automatically. There is a formal application process, and it takes time. During that time, the existing permit holder remains legally responsible for any compliance failures. That meant if Derek's team made the wrong move, the liability did not just magically disappear. Sandra sent a formal notice to Carver's legal department explaining the situation and demanding a structured transition plan. She attached a licensing fee schedule for continued use of any process documentation I had developed during my tenure. Then came the invoice. Sandra did not use round numbers. She calculated real value, licensing fees for the vendor relationship framework based on comparable consulting structures in the distribution industry, compensation for unauthorized continued use of documentation, regulatory transition liability, and what she called a knowledge transfer premium for the institutional expertise that had been eliminated without any structured offboarding. The total came to $1,642,089. At the bottom I added a short note. Carver Industrial may retain access to the above-listed materials and relationships on a provisional basis for 30 days pending formal negotiation. Continued use beyond that period without a licensing agreement will require us to notify the relevant regulatory bodies of the change in responsible party status, which may trigger compliance reviews. Sandra stared at the screen for a long moment after we finalized it. Then she asked me one question. "Do you want me to send this on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon?" I told her Monday morning. Give them the whole week to think about it. At 8:55 a.m. on Monday, Sandra sent the notice to Carver's legal department, their CEO Kevin and Derek. Derek replied at 11:40 a.m. Not to me, not to Sandra directly. He sent a separate reply to Kevin and legal and called it a nuisance claim from a disgruntled former employee. He said legal had it handled. Apparently, he had not actually spoken to legal before writing that. By Wednesday, I heard from 2 former colleagues, separately, without either knowing the other had called. The cloud logistics platform Derek had brought in was having trouble integrating with our existing DOT documentation system. That system was a custom database I had built and maintained. The login credentials and administrative access were in my name. When Derek's team tried to modify the system so it would align with his new procurement model, they triggered an access restriction I had built years earlier after a prior data issue. It was a security measure. If unauthorized modifications were attempted, the system locked the pathway until the named administrator approved the changes. That administrator was me. By Thursday morning, the pressure was no longer internal. One of the Ohio EPA field contacts called my cell phone. He had received an automated notification from their system that the responsible party on our primary storage permit had attempted to submit a modification request. The request had been flagged because the submitting party was not the named responsible individual on the permit. He wanted to know whether I was aware of the request. He wanted to know whether I had authorized it. I told him I had not authorized any change, and that I was currently in a transition period with the company. He told me the modification request had been suspended pending verification, and that an inspection might be scheduled depending on how the matter was resolved. I thanked him, hung up, and called Sandra immediately. Friday made it worse for them. A letter arrived from the Indiana Department of Environmental Management with a similar inquiry regarding 2 permits in that state. And then something changed inside Carver. Through a former colleague, I still had limited visibility into the team's channels. The energy had gone quiet. No more transformation momentum updates. No more velocity metrics. No more excited posts about modernization. Derek, I was told, kept his camera off during the all-staff call that week. That had never happened before. The following Monday, Kevin called me personally. Kevin is a decent man. He ended up inside a situation he was never equipped to navigate. When I picked up, he sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. He told me the company was experiencing some unexpected complications with the regulatory transitions and asked whether I would be willing to have a conversation. I told him I was available for consultation at my current rate and that Sandra would send the engagement terms. He said that was fine. 3 weeks after my termination, I learned from a source inside the company that Meridian Capital had received a memo from their legal team outlining the permit situation, the vendor contract complications, and the outstanding invoice. The acquisition timeline they had been working toward included a due diligence requirement around regulatory standing. Now that standing was flagged. The acquiring company's attorneys were asking questions. Derek had a call with Kevin and the Meridian partners the following Tuesday. I was not on that call, but I know what happened because Kevin called me the next day. He apologized. A real apology. Not the polished corporate version. He said bringing Derek in and letting him restructure without a proper transition plan had been a mistake. He said my contributions had been undervalued. He said the company was in a difficult position, and he did not know how to get out of it without my help. Then he paused. And he said he wanted me back. He said we could discuss any title I wanted. He said Derek would be transitioning out of the organization. I let the silence sit there for a moment. Then I gave him my condition. I keep the IP. All of it. The process documentation, the vendor framework, the system architecture. Carver could license it from me under a multi-year consulting agreement with terms that Sandra would draft and I would set. No transfer of ownership. No blanket work-for-hire language. I would hold the rights, and the company would pay to use them. If the company was sold, the licensing agreement would transfer to the acquirer as a line-item operating cost. Non-negotiable. Kevin was quiet for a long time. Then he said that was an unusual arrangement. I told him so was getting fired over a Teams call with no paperwork. He said he understood. He told me he would take it to the board. 3 days later, Sandra and I sat across from Kevin and Carver's outside counsel at a conference table in their law firm's office. I brought Paul Greco with me. Not because he was a lawyer, but because he was the man who had insisted on Section 9.2 16 years earlier, and I thought he deserved to watch it come full circle. He sat in the corner, said almost nothing, and smiled the entire time. The terms we signed that afternoon were the best of my entire career. A full licensing structure, a consulting agreement at $850 an hour, with a minimum of 20 hours a month, IP ownership retained by my LLC, which Sandra had helped me form the week before. I was named on the regulatory filings as Responsible Compliance Consultant with formal contractual authority over any changes. I had veto power over any modifications to systems bearing my documentation. And before a single signature went on that agreement, they paid the outstanding invoice. The wire transfer landed on a Thursday morning while I was drinking coffee in my home office. $1,642,089. I stared at the notification for a long time, not only because of the amount, though that money certainly solved my son's graduation concerns and my mother's care bills with room to spare. I stared at it because of what it meant. 16 years of showing up at 6:30 a.m. 16 years of being the person who read the full permit application, not the summary. 16 years of building relationships with vendors who called me during shortages because they knew I would not waste their time. Derek had looked at all of that and called it a fossil. A wire transfer is a very specific reply to that kind of opinion.